Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isfandir Batmigelic. Today's show is on economic war and economic peace. I'm delighted to have two guests whose writings on this subject have graced the pages of the New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. If there are trenches in economic wars, then my guests are two of the best correspondents writing with their boots in the metaphorical mud. Maximilian Hess is the founder of London-based political risk firm Enmetena Advisory. He is also the author of Economic War, Ukraine and Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. Max, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thanks so much for having me today.
My second guest is Nicholas Mulder. Nick is an assistant professor of history at Cornell University. He is the author of The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, which was published in 2022. Nick, great to have you.
Thank you, Yara. Very nice to be here.
So, gentlemen, for today's conversation, I wanted to look at the past, present, and future of economic war. And on the last episode of this podcast, I spoke to someone I think both of you, two people that I think both of you know, Henry Farrell and Abe Newman, whose work has made clear how today's highly globalized economy is increasingly being weaponized. But sanctions and export controls aren't new, and Nick, this is a big part of your research as a historian, and your book is an impressive work of history that shows how tools of economic warfare, including sanctions, were first conceived more than a century ago. And these tools were described in a period that you describe as an era of high globalization, the 1930s. What can we learn by looking back to the origins of modern economic warfare?
I think that one of the big things that we can learn is that as globalization has intensified and the quantities of goods and people and information and other things flowing across borders have gone up and up and up across modernity, at some point you get a qualitative shift as well. And it's once this quality of globalization reaches a certain intensity that you can start to think about using it to control the fate or the behavior of entire nations. Of course, there's always been weaponization or instrumentalization of flows, but it wasn't really conceivable that that would be something that could be instrumentalized by huge global organizations, or that could be totally decisive in most of the rest of history when countries were much more self-sufficient. There's a few other things that are very interesting about the origins of sanctions if you look at them. I go back to the blockade in the First World War, mainly because that provides really rich technical material to look at. You really see policymakers struggling to understand these flows of commodities, interdependence in the realm of money and finance. One of the things that you can already start to see is something that we still have today, which is a tension in how to think about what sanctions do. One of them is very much focusing on choke points, imports of key essential commodities. Today, technology is an important part of that. And then trying to throttle and curb the exports of those vital goods and inputs into the target economy. The first model is vital input cutoff. The second one is attrition and bleeding of foreign exchange reserves. Those were two models that were already present a long time ago, and we see them still actually as the background assumption, I think, to a lot of debates about how, for example, to impose the most meaningful pressure on Russia. And the final thing that we can really learn from the history of economic warfare is that the role of neutrals and intermediaries is very important, even in wartime blockades or in peacetime sanctions. In both cases, it is about managing the non-participating parts of the world economy. And as a result, the final sort of strategic lesson, I think, is that oftentimes we've hoped that sanctions were a quick-acting substitute for kinetic force, for example. But as a quick-acting weapon, oftentimes economic tools have proven more difficult to implement. And the success of them, at least, has proven more elusive. So in the long run, they've proven better as attritional instruments.
Max, I mean, Nick has just sort of laid out this kind of strategic view of sanctions and the idea that they, might not have the effectiveness that policymakers often expect. And one of the striking things about your book, which is very fittingly titled Economic War, is that you make a real point in the book that the economic war on Russia didn't begin in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And rather, in the very first sentence, on the very first page, you point out that Ukraine's war with Russia began in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea. and that the economic war on Russia also began in 2014 when the international community responded to Russia's aggression by imposing sanctions. So, if the economic war on Russia really began 10 years ago, one of the things that's really interesting is that we haven't often thought about it as really an economic war in response to Russian aggression until quite recently. I mean, I think Western officials have been more vocal about the fact that they are waging an economic war only since February 2022. So, what explains that shift in rhetoric? I mean, and why is it that the sanctions back then weren't something we talked about as economic war, but today they are?
Certainly. I'll begin by saying, why I certainly believe the economic war began back at the end of 2013 and 2014. And secondly, by saying also that certainly many Russian policymakers have been stating this opinion. But of course, I don't agree with them necessarily about precisely where it began. The Russian point would be to say that the use of sanctions against Russia in 2014, and even before that in 2012, when Congress passed the Magnitsky Act, was an abuse of the U.S.'s position in the geopolitical system and was bringing sanctions to bear against Russia. I detail in the book the history of sort of how the initial Magnitsky Act was passed and why I don't think it was really it certainly wasn't the Obama administration's foreign policy initiative at the time. And then also the specific use of sanctions in responding to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But Russia clearly had in its mind that it would be escalating this economic war. There was a tension at the time around Russia's vision of, the Eurasian Union and start of talk about BRICS. It really institutionalized BRICS in 2014, but it also loaned Ukraine money in this very complicated mechanism involving a euro bond, blurring the lines between official and private debt, which is a very important sort of tenement of how at least the international economic order works, as I try to explain. And so I certainly see, Russia's actions very much in Ukraine as having been intended to weaponize this. The Russians would certainly say that it was the U.S. response. And some Russians, including Vladimir Putin, who complained about the dollar system back in the PhD thesis that was most likely plagiarized for him in the late 1990s, have been, talking about dollar weaponization throughout the period even before the Soviet collapse. But, I think really the attention to it in the West has become a lot sharper since 2022, of course, because the West sanctions have really changed. They've become much wider reaching. You can find quotes from pretty much every senior official in every Western government about this being the largest sanctions program in the post-World War II era. But also the key change, and this speaks to some of the dichotomies Nick was discussing earlier as well, is our understanding of what sanctions are trying to do, or at least public policymakers' understanding of what they're trying to do has changed, and they haven't really necessarily always acknowledged that in as direct a manner. But sanctions were still often discussed in 2014, at least in the terms of the West's imposition of them against Russia and many other countries, as a tool meant to dissuade Russia from taking a certain path, meant to raise costs, meant to, effectively be a form of diplomatic tool aimed at pressuring to achieve better policy outcomes. Whereas since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 and the subsequent imposition of this very large sanctions regime against Russia, the effect of sanctions has been to effectively fight war by other means and to weaken the Russian military machine. I don't think there's any major Western policymaker who today will say that they hope one of the impacts of sanctions is to get Russia to stop its war. Certainly that ship has sailed, but sanctions play a very important role in mitigating Russia's ability to execute that conflict.
That transition you describe, Max, and let me just say as an aside, fascinating to know that Putin has a PhD thesis that touches on de-dollarization. I did not know that. I'll have to go and try and learn more about that. But the transition you describe about, the sanctions being a tool to try and deter Russia from taking certain action to understand the costs of its aggression towards Ukraine, to then being a tool of war by other means. I mean, Nick, this sounds a lot like the transition that you describe in your book between the interwar period in the 1930s, when sanctions were first being developed, really in an effort to stabilize the global economy and the global order, into a situation during the war when they became a complementary sort of policy to the actual war fighting. So, I mean, should we conclude, Nick, that this is like a recurring problem of sanctions policy, that they are first imposed with an aim of deterring certain behaviors, but when they fail to deter, then they become co-opted into the basically response to, let's say, the military action that has happened because of that failed deterrence?
Yeah, I think that that's a very plausible reading of how things go. And one of the other major things that you see in history is that policies are oftentimes begun for certain reasons and then acquire other rationales as they are developed. Other people buy into them, and that's also how you get path-dependent policies. So the reasons for which we are upholding certain measures now might not be the reason that they were initially imposed for, but you get, in a sense, sanctions entrepreneurship too, right? There are all sorts of goals that you could use. And another good example of that is Iraq in the 1990s. The sanctions were really imposed in the wake of an Iraqi war of aggression against Kuwait. But then in the 1990s, a big debate emerged after Operation Desert Storm over what exactly the sanctions against Saddam were meant to be achieving. And there wasn't ever really full consensus on that. And as a result, we now also, have it led both to a big humanitarian, of course, a problem, but also then a lot of haggling internationally over what exactly the sanctions were meant to be doing. And finally, again, in the history of conflict, you also see oftentimes that people start conflicts thinking that they're going to be wars of maneuver. February 2022 was a good example. Quick acting, and then it gets bogged down into wars of attrition. And actually, economic warfare and land warfare do have some similarity in that regard.
Max, there's a kind of passage in your book that I think is very relevant to this question of, why was it that sanctions that were imposed maybe to stabilize an economic peace ended up contributing to, or maybe because they had to, an effort of economic war. And in the passage you write, quote, 8 years after the first sanctions were introduced, the Kremlin did not expect the West to be sufficiently united to implement the most significant sanctions, and believed that the United States was at risk of overstretching itself in politicizing the dollar. So it seems like, on one hand, the Kremlin officials were wrong in their prediction, because, of course, there was this broad international coalition that came out very quickly after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and imposed significant sanctions on Russia. But on the other hand, one thing that is striking is that those sanctions are maybe weaker than they could be, particularly if you look at the fact that Russia is still allowed to export its oil, albeit subject to a price cap. So were Russian officials vindicated in their expectations that the economic war would not expand as fully as maybe that Western officials thought they could take it?
Well, I certainly myself was even surprised by just how far and wide-reaching the initial sanctions were. Yes, the Biden administration had telegraphed them, but getting Europe on board and what we've subsequently learned about the international coordination with Canada, the United Kingdom as well, there was a very clear move in the sanctions that exist on Russia today, despite loopholes existing, and Russia being, a very large country that has capabilities that certain other targets of sanctions programs don't have, is under a very sort of pinching sanctions regime where the largest area of Russia that isn't sanctioned is, of course, Russian exports. There are now some sanctions since December of 2022, a number of months later, beginning with the oil price cap. Europe has put in some restrictions on Russian coal. We just had new Russian metals sanctions on Friday. So there's slow development there. But with regards to targeting specific Russian import sectors connected to the war, the lists were very large at the beginning. Yes, there were some coordination problems. South Korea didn't get on board with some key sanctions exports on machine tools initially, so that led to some leakage. But the banking sanctions, the central bank sanctions, were as large as I think the West could have hoped for in that environment. Russia's opinion and sort of analysis that Europe was divided came from the result of having built up significant allegiances within a number of political parties, primarily on the right, but also occasionally on the left, and for example, in Catalonia, across Europe, and finding positions of key influence there. The level of economic exposure was very high as well. We, of course, can discuss, if we have time, the German strategy of essentially building its industry on cheap Russian gas in particular. And then, of course, the fact that there was almost no response to Russia's other intervention, which wasn't an invasion in the same way, and is a complex topic in its own right. I don't want to oversimplify, but when Russia did send troops into Kazakhstan in January of that year to respond to a political crisis, there was no reaction from the West whatsoever, and no threatening of sanctions. So I think Russia was overconfident in it. I think it largely miscalculated due to factors that have to do with the fact of where the conflict took place and it being a European conflict and not an Asian one. But is the sanctions program are there more individual companies and the like sanctioned than there are perhaps in relation to the Iran or North Korea programs? Yes. Is the sanctions regime significantly tighter or more wide-ranging than those? I would argue no. But it's closer than I would have expected.
And I think, Max, that's a really interesting way of framing it because, it points out that, yes, there is still this significant economic pain that's being levied on Russia, but there are these features of the sanctions program that, reflect political choices, including by the sanctioning countries. So interesting to highlight that, maybe exports have been less of a focus than trying to target Russia's imports, which is understandable given the importance of those imports for running a war economy. But Nick, in the first, year or so after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the major economic sanctions that were imposed in response, there was a lot of concern about sort of the destabilizing effect for the global economy. And leaders in the global South were among the most vocal, suggesting that, any effort to stem Russian exports of critical commodities, agricultural goods, would possibly hurt them the most when you look at sort of the possible shocks for the global economy writ large. So what does it mean that leaders and ordinary people in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia are having to contend with economic warfare on other countries and possibly worry about the ripple effects for them in a globalized economy?
Yeah, I think a lot of those issues emerged because we have much better G7 coordination now than a while ago. But the G20 has obviously been torn in half by this conflict very much. At the same time, the BRICS don't add up to a coherent coalition for managing these issues in a kind of global South sphere either. So what we're left with is basically a North Atlantic and East Asian coalition of countries that is quite capable of high-level coordination, but a lot of issues downstream that result from their coordination. And there's not really any other international financial institution. The IMF and the World Bank don't seem to be able to step in to deal with the consequences of that very readily. A very good example of it is that Europe avoided what many people expected in 2022, which was a major recession. Actually, that year, growth did reasonably okay under the circumstances for the whole EU. And large part of that was, of course, because they were able to compensate for the cutoff of Russian gas with increased LNG shipments. But those LNG shipments had to be procured on world markets, had to be bought essentially from under the noses of large Asian importers, Pakistan and Bangladesh most notably. Pakistan is still in dire straits, right? So to me, what's important about this from a global economic point of view is that you see the interconnection between the different sanctions regimes. You see also the residual effect of sanctions on Venezuela and Iran that have been in effect for a long time, now constraining the room for maneuver with regard to Russian sanctions. It was not possible to do oil sanctions on Russia the way we did it in Venezuela and Iran. So there's trade-offs now, right? Sanctions enforcement against Iran has been noticeably weaker in the last year. And Venezuela too, there's been moves towards relaxing them now, all I think also in order to expand room for maneuver against Russia. So you start to see real trade-offs, not just between the different countries under sanctions, but also between who is able to use their own economic position in the kind of global hierarchy to secure what they have. And at the moment, there's a bunch of secular or conjunctural economic factors, rather, that also make it just difficult for emerging markets, for middle-income economies, noticeably that we are seeing energy prices still really elevated and potentially trending up again in the next few months. And now the thing that's correlated with that, a very strong dollar. So you get both a credit and a lending channel shock for emerging markets and developing economies, and On top of that, energy costs and therefore imports for many of them being very elevated. So all of that means, right, I don't think it's undermining dollar hegemony, but it's a very stable form of dysfunctionality of the dollar system, because these things are now very correlated, energy prices and dollar strength.
And Max, I'm curious to know what you think of kind of these trade-offs that Nick has laid out.
Well, I certainly strongly agree with the latter point, and I make it myself in the end of my book by saying, in some way the dollar is an anti-fragile system, to use Nicholas Nassim Taleb's framework. It is one that sort of gains from chaos. I would argue the point that yes, certainly there are trade-offs, and the Pakistan case is a particularly interesting one to me, and one where we see a lot of the geopolitics of this play out as well, because yes, Pakistan was a real loser, and it had actually done the right thing from sort of, at least if it had hired, and it probably did, management consultants before, and it had diversified into the LNG industry away from coal for years, but because the contracts with international commodity shippers included relatively cheap break clauses, they were able to sell it at far larger prices to the West. Now, I was in Lahore recently discussing the book, and it was quite interesting there that a Pakistani official who'd served in the subsequent government, because this had major geopolitical ramifications in Pakistan itself as well, with the ouster of Imran Khan in the summer of 2022, effectively acknowledged to me that Pakistan had subsequently then gotten its IMF bailout in exchange for agreeing to export some ammunition to Ukraine. So, all these things are highly interconnected. Pakistan is now going, back to the IMF. What I would say is, despite there being some limitations on how the West has imposed its sanctions, and there being a lot of talk around the BRICS system, I think there's far too little attention focused to the fact that shoring up the U.S.-European alliance in particular, when one thinks about these things strategically, is the most important outcome for the role of the dollar system, even if non-Western countries and this G20 and Global South chafe at it more. And this is because the structure of international finance. And essentially, Nick's points are all very accurate about the lack of coordinating mechanisms within BRICS and sort of the issues those countries have in operating together. But even if they could, and even if they got together more effectively, Brazil, Russia, India, China, we can, leave out South Africa now given the economic situation there, but these are all massive surplus earning countries. They need deficit markets in which to export those excess earnings. The only ones with no capital controls we can talk about Switzerland and Credit Suisse's bankruptcy and Greek bailouts, but the only one with a international market system and debt markets that people broadly trust is Europe and the United States. So long as those remain in close alignment there, it becomes very hard to build up an alternative system that can really challenge dollar hegemony. And now, do I think there are long-term efforts to do so, and the West poses significant risks in its failure to understand these topics, and why I'm so glad that you're doing such a great series of podcasts on them. But I would actually argue that this system has in many ways been strengthened in the last 2 years rather than weakened.
So, geopolitically, I think there is a very compelling case that the coordinated response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially around things like sanctions policies, has repaired a transatlantic relationship that was very frayed, particularly during the Trump years. But it's not as though there hasn't been some impact on domestic politics in the West. And you have a chapter in your book, Max, where you talk about the inflation weapon and the idea that the contribution of economic war on Russia, particularly through higher energy prices, to the cost of living crisis in Europe, did lead to some challenges in the domestic political sphere in Europe in particular, where, as you mentioned, there are far-right parties and far-left parties that are maybe more sympathetic to the Russian cause, but even if they're not sympathetic to Russia, at least don't understand why the Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine should come at the expense of ordinary households. Tell us a little bit about how you see that political debate evolving in Europe. And also, there was one interesting piece of news, I think, this week where it appears that activists in Switzerland are going to have a referendum on Swiss neutrality that would in part require a rethinking of Swiss sanctions policy.
Great. Well, I mean, first I have to say the inflation weapon reference I actually took from a paper that you wrote discussing the impact of Western and U.S. sanctions on Iran in particular, and I thought it was both a very good description and a useful term, even if I was kind of turning it on its head by,
Yeah, you turned it on its head, which is very cool. Yeah.
Well, Russia did impose counter sanctions on Europe, but not on exporting its gas and things there. It did things like ban Morgan Freeman and academics from coming to its country. I think that Europe, the economic pain was not as large as expected, but the inflation shock did have real geopolitical impacts. I was certainly more concerned about how large the economic pain was going to be. I think it could still be sustained, and I think that that's one thing in policymakers' conversation right now is that Russia still has economic weapons of its own that it can use, right? If Russia shuts off oil, there are those who would argue that, the West should stop all Russian oil exports, try to do like it did in Venezuela or Iran. But of course, if all Russian oil exports went to zero, the global oil price, tomorrow would probably be $200 a barrel, if not more, and then Saudi Arabia and how it responds as the remaining swing producer is hugely important. There's ways that Russia may still use some of those economic weapons, and that isn't over. I think in some ways we got lucky through the scale of response and having a relatively good, or at least cooperative set of leaders in office at the time, but there's no guarantee that will continue. There are, of course, other issues, and Russia's not going to stop its attempts to work with governments that are sort of more friendly to it or populist parties that it can try to partner with to undermine some of these things. With regards to the Swiss referendum in particular, I will say, it's a fascinating case, and Switzerland has been one of the countries alongside Singapore and South Korea that were major additions to the international coalition sanctioning Russia after the full-scale invasion last year. But Blocher, who's a sort of, yodeling Nigel Farage character, the head of the Swiss People's Party, has used this issue to re-injuvenate himself in his daughter runs the party now in politics there, and try to make a populist cause out of this, and that's something we've seen certainly play a role in other European elections as well, in Slovakia more recently, and will continue to be a theme certainly in Austria in particular as well, despite there being the largest Russian espionage scandal in many years, despite one happening every 6 months. Right now, the party that wants to continue Austria's buying of gas is by far in the lead in the polls, and make no secret of the fact, and in fact its previous leader had lost his job over one of the other Russian spying scandals. There are still touch points in Europe where, despite everything that's happened in Ukraine, it can try to undermine this from within, and that battle is not over, and obviously elections in Europe and in the US may play a very large role in shaping that in the months to come.
I have to say, the image of a yodeling Nigel Farage is particularly terrifying.
He's also a billionaire, by the way.
Great. Even better. Nick, last year you published an op-ed in the New York Times titled "Sanctions Against Russia Ignore the Economic Challenges Facing Ukraine." And it occurs to me that that's basically what we've just done on this show so far. We have talked about sanctions against Russia and not talked about the economic challenges facing Ukraine. And the provocative point you make in the op-ed is that, to an extent, the intense focus on trying to tighten the sanctions on Russia has come at the expense of maybe a more robust and honest discussion among Western policymakers about the kind of support Ukraine needs financially and militarily to really win the war. And you go so far as to explain that sanctions are, quote, a sideshow and not the main area in which Ukraine's future will be determined. Tell us a little bit about what you meant by sanctions being a sideshow, and what is the correction in policy that you were getting at?
Yes, I think some economic history can really have a clarifying function here, because an underlying issue, it seems to me, in the Russian-Ukrainian relationship in the last few decades has been the divergence in economic well-being and prosperity and uneven development. So Russia, for example, right, has managed not just to regain some of its previous stature as a commodity superpower, it very much expanded the productivity of its agriculture and went from being in the late Soviet period a food importer to being a big food exporter. And it exports, now if it has a good harvest, 5 or 6 times as much grain as Ukraine does. So what that shows is that Ukraine, although it in the early 2000s, when you had a big emerging markets boom, was somewhat riding on the coattails of that, really hasn't managed to build a good long-run developmental model. And this has made it weak and vulnerable, not just to internal issues, right, oligarchic fighting, but also, of course, to Russian interference and Russian predation. And one of the big underlying things, if we think about this as a crisis on the eastern border of Europe, is that the EU, I think, has been really dramatically successful in the long run in bringing Eastern Europe into a relatively shared level of well-being with the West. If you go to Poland now, all of the cities and streets look nicer than Germany. I mean, it's also because Germany's been underinvesting in infrastructure, but it's quite remarkable the success of economic cohesion policies. Now, Ukraine is going to be a huge challenge in that regard, but it's clear that in the long run, if Ukraine wants to be strong and independent and have some sort of decent level of sovereignty, that to me is going to be the foundation. And we talk about that far too little, and it's been set back since the war on that path. The EU actually has a particular set of expertise, and that's also why I think the discussions about NATO, important as they are, sidestep the fact that it's not NATO that builds schools and hospitals and roads and bridges, it's EU structural funds. So to my mind, still that is the long-term horizon that really matters. And I think future historians in several decades from now will see this conflict as having emerged out of uneven development in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that ultimately is, I think, the sort of scale and the set of challenges in which we should think of this conflict. So given all of that, the sanctions against Russia, while important, are not, I think, the prime thing shaping the outcome of the war. It's first of all, of course, a military confrontation, but the underlying thing that generates the ability to mobilize, that generates the ability to have diplomatic power and leverage in the rest of the world, has something to do also with how well your economy is doing. And I think there, particularly the EU, has a challenge cut out for itself. But it's one that in our focus on military assistance, but particularly on sanctions, tends to be very much lost. And in fact, there, right, you have an outsourcing of some of Ukrainian sovereign finance to entities like BlackRock, who I do not think have the right set of interests in mind when it comes to long-run Ukrainian development. That really should be something that people at the European Commission and the European Development Bank have a determinative say in. Yeah.
Max, I want to get your reaction to this idea that, maybe our focus on sanctions has distracted from diagnosing this kind of developmental problem that Ukraine faced that contributed to it being in a weak position vis-a-vis Russia. But at the same time, I want to understand the extent to which you agree with the idea that the strong emphasis on sanctions as the foremost policy through which the West was going to respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine has maybe come at the expense of U.S. and European officials committing sooner and more committedly, or let's say committing sooner and more decisively to providing financial and military support to Ukraine. I mean, is that a trade-off that has existed? Has one policy sort of cannibalized support for the others?
I don't know if I would say that sort of focus on sanctions policy post-2014 has led to a negation of focus on economic policy for Ukraine. Of course, one of the big successes of 2014 and the goals of the revolution was the signing of a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. There were crucial U.S. support in IMF negotiations. I mean, the IMF changed its rules to help accommodate Ukraine against Russian economic warfare, that sort of bond that I talked about earlier. And I think that was the right thing to do. What I would say is I think one important other factor, right, and this will be the key one for many historians of Ukraine to debate, where I think it's maybe to put the cart before the horse, but what I would say is the idea that Ukraine's lack of economic development led to more Russian predation has it backwards. Russian predation led to the lack of Ukraine's economic development throughout the years from 1991. And certainly many Ukrainians would argue even before 1991, where I think the picture is much more complicated, despite obviously the legacy of the Holodomor and many other tragedies in Ukraine's Soviet history. I think Nick is completely right in saying that the peace will be won based on Ukraine's economic future and aid on those side of things. Getting to the stage where peace is even something envisageable, sanctions in their role of constraining the Russian military machine will play an inordinate role. That being said, there can't be neglecting Ukraine's financial support. We've seen the cost of that just in recent weeks by, my estimate, as much as 80% of Ukraine's thermal power generation has been taken offline in the last 2 months alone. That's years and years to rebuild because of a lack of Western air support for Ukraine, because the U.S. financing bill is stuck there. We have seen some movements on seizing frozen Russian sovereign assets. So there's the potential that more funding will come in a sustainable manner there. But of course, that's a very hotly debated political issue as well and comes with its own costs and concerns and developments, but things are slowly moving, at least in the right direction. So yes, I certainly agree that the peace will finally be won through the economic support for rebuilding Ukraine, how that's done and how it's reformed. But until we get to that conversation, sanctions will form an equally important and in some certain cases more important role about ensuring we can get to the conversation of a peace rather than a continued war or long-term Russian occupation and removal of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Max, I think the point you raise about the predation maybe preventing Ukrainian development is a really important one. I mean, it sounds like there's a kind of vicious cycle here that can begin at some point and then just sort of become self-perpetuating. But going back to you, Nick, I mean, it's interesting because the way that you just framed this issue was that the idea of supporting economic development in Ukraine is somewhat mutually exclusive to the idea of sanctions and economic weapons and economic coercion more generally. And one of the really interesting things in your book is that you describe how at the origin of economic sanctions, the idea of an economic weapon had two meanings. It meant not only the use of sanctions and export controls to try and deny an adversary resources, but it also meant actively providing societies with material resources rather than depriving them. And so during World War I, in particular, you saw this idea of using an economic weapon to support allies by providing arms and financial resources, other essential commodities. How did we get to the point where we no longer think of the provision of economic support as part of fighting a war quite as much as we think of trying to deny the enemy access to economic resources?
Well, this has, I think, a lot to do with our capacity to marshal major resources for investment in a public and democratically decided way. We have tended to outsource that stuff much more to the private sector. You see it in climate finance, you see it in other areas. And there are some arguments in favor of that, but one of the things that's clearly done in political debate is just impoverish our imagination about what can be done by marshalling these sorts of resources. In COVID, you saw some of it come back when it comes to vaccines, but across the board, I think there's a sense, certainly since the 1970s and 80s, that governments need to focus on other things and that they are too constrained. So the demise of that kind of mid-century administrative interventionist Keynesian state has had an effect on how we think about economic statecraft too. It has simply become more attractive to use these tools of financial sanctions. I just want to say one quick thing about the last point about predation and lack of economic development. I think the reading that I have of the economic history that led Ukraine to being vulnerable is that in 1990 it was a very affluent part of the Soviet Union, right? Its GDP was actually quite high. It had a significant amount of high-tech, capital-intensive industry, and all across the 1990s that fell away. Part of it was cannibalized. It deindustrialized the country. But Russia was undergoing a similar process. And I think Ukraine really fell between a rock and a hard place. It was not close enough to Western Europe to serve as a viable location for the outsourcing of European, for example, car manufacturing, the way that East Central European countries did. At the same time, it was entering a world economy now where both China and Eastern Europe were fulfilling that function. So there wasn't a big enough niche. And there was no state to lead its entry, no effective state to lead its entry into that niche in the world economy. So I would say that to me, that's really the kind of big backdrop, because Ukraine was not in the position of a colonial country. It was actually part of an industrial core. And many of the first Ukrainian leaders, right, Kravchuk, all came from that missile industrial aerospace engineering complex. So I think there's a complicated story, and it needs to be told in more detail. But certainly the dismantling and the falling away of coherent state capacity in the 90s had something to do with it. And in Russia, of course, right, the part of the state that survived was the security state that definitely had a predatory character on the Russian economy domestically and since outwards. So I think, Yar, to your point about the positive economic weapon, it's something that we see in macroeconomic policy. We've definitely come around, right, to the idea that you should simulate other countries' economies, and certainly our own, much more since 2008. I think, however, that we are just too stuck still in a very restrained sense of what's possible. And one other part where you see it now is, of course, in debates about whether the West has an adequate military industrial base, right, a productive base. There too, arguably, Iran and Russia have embraced this new switch quite quickly, whereas we are still talking about, exactly how do we structure the incentives for there to be more production of artillery, ammunition, etc. So I think this has a lot to do with a much broader shift in our political and economic imagination.
Wherever we come down on the debate about, what were the factors that explain Ukraine's underdevelopment and its position of weakness, I think the diagnosis that you have there, Nick, about this decline of political imagination, that leaders can't imagine sort of using the state as a vehicle to try and support economic development in other countries. I agree with you that the European Union is maybe unusually one of the few kind of supranational bodies that still does that effectively. But it is concerning because that decline in political imagination might mean that we are unable to imagine what an economic peace looks like. So implicit in this idea that there's a thing called economic war is an idea that there's a thing called economic peace. And Max, in your book, you look forward to the potential end of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And you argue, I think compellingly, that we need to imagine what it looks like to actually reintegrate Russia into the global economy. And I'll quote from the book: "The West should ensure that Russia's eventual return to the international economic order is contingent on its honoring its neighbors' sovereignty, the depoliticization of commodity supplies, and the return of democracy." Now, assuming that Russia is able to meet those conditions, do you think that Western governments are really in a position to furnish the tools that are necessary to sort of contribute to Russian reintegration to the global economy and reconstruction, given the dilemmas that Nick just sort of outlined?
Short answer is no. And I think, this speaks to Nick's points earlier as well, and your points. I would push back and say if we accept that the European Union is decent about thinking about how it can use the power of the state, then that's already a failure of our imagination, because the European Union finally managed to issue joint debt with Corona bonds, but hasn't been able to go further since. My visions for European Union success at doing these things, despite speaking from Brexit London, are far greater, and I think the European Union could have far more institutional and financial power. In the U.S., I think it would be impossible to get. I disagree with the most widely held shibboleths about, sort of deficit politics and concerns about growing U.S. indebtedness. I think still a lot more can be handled, and we have ridiculous debt ceiling fights almost every year now due to partisanship in the United States. I think the idea, even paying to help reconstruct Ukraine is going to be hugely difficult. And right now, the imagination, as Nick correctly criticizes, is like, oh, what can BlackRock help, do about this? And I'm like, they cannot. Economic historians who have looked at how states have helped loan to other states and the like are the kind of people you need to be speaking to, not those who can, finance it and sell it, securitize it, and sell it to as many pension funds as possible.
Nick, I'm curious to get your reactions to that. It's a pretty bleak outlook because not only are we sort of hoping for a fundamental political change in Russia that would allow us to even consider a kind of negotiated end to this war and consider the kind of broad sanctions relief that would bring Russia back into the international economic order. But it also sounds like we need to do some fundamental rethinking about the parameters of economic war in the West. And Max just brought up the Iran example. You and I wrote an article in 2019 looking at this issue of sanctions reconstruction and kind of reflecting on the fact that when it came to Iran, we weren't institutionally able to lift sanctions in a way that really made the diplomacy robust. How dire is this problem? And do you think that there is an effort on the part of policymakers to try and rekindle their political imagination when it comes to this issue?
No, sadly not. I think that's not something that should stop us from talking about it and being creative in putting forward more measures. One, part of this toolkit of what we've described earlier and what we've thought about as sanctions relief policy could be, in the current environment, to use swap lines and low interest rate loans directly from central banks, to actually use that as something that we can use strategically, particularly when you're dealing with high Fed funds rates in economies that are potentially really in need of that sort of liquidity. That's something that's very helpful. I also agree that we need to think about what future scenarios for change are imaginable in Russia and what kind of institutional reform the Russian state may or may not need. What sort of deformations and developments have occurred as a result of this war. And here, one thing that I'm interested in following in the long run is what the effect has been of the relocation of commodity trading to largely from Switzerland now to the Gulf and other places, Hong Kong and Singapore, because we know that a lot of these entities operating ships and the dark fleet emerged right before or just in the wake of February 2022. But we don't exactly know how much of the revenues made there, which are presumably very considerable, flow back towards the Kremlin. So a lot of the government finance has become very opaque. Is it held offshore? Is this actually undermining the fiscal base of the Russian state in the long run? All of that will be a quite relevant question for future Russian governments. And so I think those are the sort of changes we need to think about, right? How can you actually secure not only access to resources from other countries, but even your own access to resources? And this is, of course, something that for Iran is also very important, right? It's frozen reserves abroad still.
I mean, we could talk about this for another hour, even more, but we're at the end of our time, which means that I need to ask you both the question that we ask each of our guests. Nick, starting with you, when did you realize that sanctions were changing the world?
I think one of the most shocking realizations that I had was when I was reading in the archives of the British Ministry of Blockade, and I came across a file that had to do with the interdiction of nitrate exports from Chile to Imperial Germany in World War I. And this was passed over relatively quickly. The bureaucrats at the time said, yeah, of course, nitrates are used for gunpowder production. We should make sure that Germany doesn't have access to that. And they promptly cut it off. Chile was one of the main exporters of nitrates to Germany. And now we know, in retrospect, that this actually launched one of the major inventions that sustained the 20th century, the Haber-Bosch process. Fritz Haber, this chemist, came up with a way of fixing nitrogen out of the air, and that I think it's a pretty viable contender for one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century, because 40% of the world's population would not have the food necessary to survive if it hadn't been for the increase in fertilizer that the Haber-Bosch process enabled. So that would be one example of how the consequences of sanctions and blockades are both hugely influential. And I don't necessarily think that there's something like that waiting to happen in Russia, but the chip export controls on China, I think, are a more interesting case. There, it may be that some new invention is prompted by this, and we don't really know the consequences of it. So again, it doesn't mean that always happens. It's not uniformly the case that necessity breeds invention. Sometimes it just causes degradation. But I will say that with China, there's a country where I think they do certainly have the potential to cause something like that. So to me, that just really shows, right, that this can have a really big effect in the long run.
So sanctions as a catalyst for innovation is super, super interesting. Max, when did you realize that sanctions were changing the world?
I mean, I love the Haber-Bosch and Futaba story. Sadly, mine is nowhere near as good. It was 2014, and I was doing my master's at the time and working for a security consultancy, and I'd been in Ukraine sort of for the last few weeks of the revolution, and I came back, and somebody I'd met at a work conference before was like, wait, you understand financial markets, sort of? I was like, I know how a bond works and stuff. Like, that's what I learned before. And you're interested in Russia and their economic policy? And I said, that's what I'm doing my thesis on. And they said, great. Every single one of London's largest banks and insurance companies, their number one and number two exposures are Gazprom and Rosneft. And they're getting hit and threatened with sanctions. And please, can we give you a job? I was like, wow, this thing that I've been interested in for a really long time, that everybody said, don't study Russia and, economic foreign policy. That would have been interesting in the 80s, or a way to make good money in the 90s. All of a sudden, people wanted to know about it. That was that certainly set me on the career path I've been on ever since, and working with these issues. And, I always say I'm not happier that these issues are so much in the news today, right? I was interested in them before they were relevant. It's a tragedy that they have ended up that way. That doesn't mean as I said earlier, don't support their continued implementation. But the fact that we've gotten there does not prove that sanctions are a policy failure, but that policy failures have happened elsewhere.
So sanctions is a catalyst for career change, another sort of silver lining kind of outcome here. Max, it was great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Yaron. Great to be in conversation with you, Max.
I'm Esfandiar Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions and is supported by a grant from the Halling Center for International Dialogue. Thanks for listening.